Good morning, LinkedIn. Welcome to Thursdays with Culture Talk. I am Cynthia Forstman, dialed in from Denver, Colorado, and I am here with Teresa Agresta.
Teresa, you want to say? Yeah. Good morning from Saratoga Springs, New York. Very excited to be here on this beautiful April morning, talking to you again about culture.
Awesome. Let me just cue us up for this week. If you have been part of the culture conversation anywhere in any organization, you know that culture can be a very challenging topic to talk about. And so often what we see is that the conversation gets stuck. It gets stuck on the surface, and we use these very generic culture is good or bad, right? Or we get talking about programs, we get talking about perks, things that we've been told we can do to improve our culture.
Symptoms, right? Those surface level things.
Surface level symptoms. And what we're here to tell you today, and what we believe at Culture Talk, is that it's more complex than that. A workplace culture is actually created by human beings and by human interactions and decision-making that takes place over time. It shows up not in the employee handbook, but in the lived experience of what it feels like to be part of an organization. And that's why culture can sometimes feel abstract, it can feel intangible, it can feel hard to talk about. And the Culture Talk toolset was actually built and designed to address just that, to create a way of talking about culture, a common language, if you will, that allows us to measure culture, shift it, scale it, share it, all sorts of great things. So since January, Teresa and I have been, and other guests on our LinkedIn Lives, have been exploring a number of different critical paths that the Culture Talk toolset allows people to do in an easier fashion. We are now on path number 2, which is culture shift and culture transformation. And that's what we're here to talk about this morning. We actually last month interviewed an OD leader and one of our Culture Talk partners about a culture shift that's underway, shifting out of a toxic culture. And then more recently, Teresa and I had a conversation about who owns and shapes and transforms culture and all the different, job titles that are part of culture shift experiences. So we'll drop a link to both of those previous conversations in the comments below. But today I'm really excited because we're going to pick up with a how-to episode. So literally, if you have decided that your culture needs to shift in some fashion to support a strategy, a growth initiative, how to do that? How do you design an engagement that goes below the surface, that gets at that deeper level of human motivation and meaning, and becomes something that builds momentum and lasts, has a stickiness to it?
Yeah. Goodness. Thank goodness we're getting to the how-to, right? How do you do this?
I
think another question, and we can kind of toss this in and try and tackle it a little bit along the way is, and we hear this a lot, how long will it take? Because I think there are 2 sets of perceptions that I hear when that how long question comes up. And one is, well, we're going to just do this quick hit program and check the box. And the other is, oh my God, we can't undertake it. It will take forever. It'll never be done. Maybe it'll take years and years to accomplish this. So in our how-to, maybe we can also address how long and share some experiences around what we're seeing in terms of how long does it take to begin seeing that kind of transformation that we're looking for.
Yeah. And I also think, since we're on questions, let's talk about why. Why do sometimes organizations hit that moment when a culture shift needs to happen? What's that connection between culture and strategy, if you will?
Yeah. Well, to answer that question, I want to just take a little side road and share an article that I came across last week that kind of digs into all of that and kind of a real live case study. So it caught my eye because like many of you probably have been seeing a lot of content out there about the weight loss drug Ozempic. And so this article didn't sort of at first look like a culture transformation article, but it talked about the King Kong of weight loss drugs. So a real attention grabbing article in the Wall Street Journal by Peter Loftus was the author. And but when I got to the sort of the subtext, I was really engaged because it was clear to me this was an article about culture transformation. And the company at play here is Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical company. And the gist of the article takes a look at how did they get this new and up and coming drug to market, and how might it become the King Kong of weight loss drugs? Because at Eli Lilly, they made some very strategic long-term decisions to shift the way they were bringing drugs to market, and recognized really clearly that the outcomes they wanted to achieve would not be possible without changing their culture.
Wow.
So the story goes like this, and I would encourage you to go out and find this article called "The King Kong."
Drop it in the comments as well. So
yeah, we'll drop it in the comments. And you can check it out for yourself. But the subtitle says, to develop the drug, the company needed to overhaul long-held but failing practices. So how do you take a company that is well over 100 years old and start to shift their long-held development practices, especially when it comes to pharmaceuticals and the research processes that go into drug development, that were essentially practices that no longer were, helping the company be successful, and in fact were continuously dragging them down. How do you create culture transformation, right? So a couple of things that stuck out to me is they were following the practices because they had always followed the practices. And as a huge organization, they were probably exhibiting some of that, this is the way we do it, ruler, shadow sides that were not enabling them to move very quickly. Tied to some of the shadow sides of the sage archetype, which is, really looking at the research process and continuing to allow people to slow things down in order to roll out every aspect and really dive into every aspect, which you might imagine from a drug manufacturer, we appreciate, right? We want them to be really clear that the research and the science have been vetted and tested. And so Eli Lilly was watching other companies overtake the relaunch and the approval and the success of new drugs on the market, even though they were using the practices that had been successful for them for so many, really decades.
Painful to see that.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And that's some of the language that the executives interviewed for the article used. I think one of the phrases that stood out to me was, we got to find a way out of this, indicating it's a cycle. We continue to see the same results because we have a pattern that's repeating itself that we repeat over and over again as part of a cycle within our organization. And even more painful when that cycle takes so many years to play out, right? So we're not talking about product development that, is fast here. We're talking about product development for drugs that is intentionally and should be slow. So when you're looking at changing a pattern like that, it's even more challenging. So the article dives into the things that they started to do, such as welcoming people.
Did they recognize that it was a culture problem? Did they call it a culture problem?
They do. They absolutely recognized it was a culture transformation, and they needed to sort of stop and identify what practices do we need to change, because these are having very clear direct line impact on our business results and our outcomes. And they could point to drugs that competitors had released and market share that they lost. They could point to decisions that were made around the timeframes for releasing, and even decisions that were made to hold back on things intentionally, so as not to cannibalize the sale of their existing products on the market.
Oh, sure.
So there were multiple, strategies at play that were almost competing within the organization, and each one adding up to some real challenges for the success and the longevity of their products in the company. And so,
What'd they do?
yeah, so what they did was start to take a look at it. So what I'm fascinated by is they literally took that sage archetype and they turned it to a positive, so let's now analyze what's going on here. So not a bad thing. They were able to take that energy and turn it into different direction and say, what do we need to shift so that we can speed up this process? And so they were looking to tap into that strength of the hero pattern. And how do we, accelerate what we're doing here so that we can stop, holding our own feet on the ground? How do we get some of these things moving more quickly? And that's where this King Kong of obesity drugs was born, out of this new process that is really looking like a very strong performer financially and has great potential. And of course, as I started out by saying, everybody's eyes are on these articles, these new drugs that are on the market in the obesity space. So the timing is, almost like a perfect storm of bringing this drug to market at this time.
Wow.
It's, tremendous financial potential, but it's not just this. This is just an example, a headline grabbing example of a shift in the way that they prioritized things internally so that they could start to have the, strategic successes that they were looking for as an organization. And it's been game-changing for them.
Wow.
And they definitely point to culture shift. And I can't wait to dig further into it and apply more archetype thinking to it, because when you speak that language of archetype, it becomes some handles. It gives you an opportunity to get your arms around those patterns on repeat.
Well, I was going to pull that out. So in your description of what's happened at Eli Lilly, Teresa's referenced sage, she's referenced ruler, she's referenced hero. And in the work that we're doing at Culture Talk, those are archetypes. They are human storylines that we all recognize, and they are patterns of behavior. That's why we're kind of focused on patterns of behavior. So, in thinking about, now let's move, because we didn't work with Eli Lilly on a culture shift.
Right.
We're kind of going in through the back door and recognizing some of the patterns that existed, both the strengths of those patterns as well as kind of the shadows of those patterns, the things that were getting in the way of them being competitive. So now let's bring that into, because we have a number of partners in our Culture Talk network that are also working on large cultural transformations.
Yeah.
And this pattern seeking is part of what, identifying patterns and measuring patterns is a big piece of what they're out to do. So let's shift into, if you were to take the Culture Talk tool set that measures archetypal patterns, how would you design a major, let's just say like a culture shift or a major cultural transformation? Teresa, we know we don't want it to be an event. We don't want it to be something done on the surface. How do it's not just, we don't want it just to be the name, we're doing a culture change.
And also, go back to that first, question about how long, like, it's not an event, right? It doesn't happen in a long powwow, let's get together for a week and, dive into this.
Yeah.
But it doesn't take years and years. And I would say that the 12 to 18 month time frame is a reasonable time frame to really begin to diagnose and address culture patterns and identify the direct outcomes of our repeated, leaning into the same culture patterns, and begin to make some clear and distinct measurable shifts around that. So thinking about a process and about a realistic time frame for achieving that process, I think is helpful to set some parameters with that.
So in that 12 to 18 months, in terms of designing, we definitely want to talk about a process that's not just the top down, right? Not just a group of leaders, if the people at Eli Lilly had just said, we need to change. And here's the
handed it down, right? Which would have been, with that ruler pattern at play, that would have been probably tempting to hand it down. We're going to change and here's how. Now,
everybody get on board.
Everybody do it. Yeah.
Exactly. So how do we want to think about how do we change based on, an inside out approach, an approach where every employee in an organization starts to go, oh, I see how I am part of the change that needs to happen. And it may require me as an individual, as a leader, as someone on a particular team to shift and change too, in the spirit of moving a strategy forward and shifting the culture in a way that can, that we have the infrastructure to make that strategy happen. So that's what we want to talk about a little bit in our design. So we want to create an intervention, 12 to 18 months, where everybody knows their part. Teresa, I love when you've described it in the past, like being at a sporting event where one of those audience waves takes hold and it goes around the whole stadium and everyone knows it's coming. It's my turn. This is what I do to contribute to this shared experience.
Right. Yeah. And it captures the inherent excitement of that. And it gets everybody. So I know my part and I can't wait. I'm excited about participating. I foresee a positive, outcome. I foresee benefit, to participating in this. So I think that this goes to the heart of the integrated approach that takes a look at, all right, so it's an inside out and a from the bottom up process that asks everyone to respond to, and in the culture talk work that we do, we measure. What's our point A? What is the status quo? What are the patterns that are currently at play? Had we done this work with Eli Lilly, we would have done an assessment that helped us to name the patterns and validate the patterns and to say, yeah, this practice that we've held for the last 50 years, well, that aligns with this pattern. And we keep doing it because we've been doing it. So culture is the same thing, right? And then without an intervention, without a shift, we're going to keep doing it as well. And without an understanding of what the pattern is and what we would like to change it to, it can feel really random. Like, we need to change. Like, so stop doing this. Well, what are we going to start doing? What shift, what change is going to lead us toward the outcomes that we're looking to achieve?
I want to mention one more thing when you say that. I think sometimes like Eli Lilly could have been in this situation of like, instead of looking at their own patterns, looking outward to what were their competitors doing.
Absolutely.
And we can't learn from what's happening in the marketplace, but is that pattern going to work here? Because we need to start by understanding our own patterns to even see the things that are getting in the way of our success.
And there's so many times, like a shift that we have been watching over the past 8 months now, where it's not a bad pattern. They're just leaning into the challenging aspects of the pattern. So they're leaning into the shadow of the pattern. And one of the shifts really needs to be, hey, stick with what you're good at, stick with what you know, just stay in the strength of that pattern. Recognize where it's helping you, recognize where it might be dragging you down, and make some clear distinctions around behaviors that will support, leaning into the strength of the pattern. So you're right. It's not about looking at what the competitors are doing, although it obviously is important. We're not here to say, don't watch your competitors. Continue watching to what's going on internally. And I think that's the first part, right? So to measure and validate, well, where are we and why and what's happening?
We call that process a baseline culture audit. And part of the culture talk tool set that our network uses, our partner network uses, is an actual cultural assessment that measures these archetype patterns that we're referencing here. So part of the baseline, that's kind of the quantitative measure of the culture. And in a baseline culture audit, we're also still going to need qualitative information. We're still going to have to go out and talk to people in the organization, talk to people at different levels, talk to people in different groups, maybe talk to different customers or clients out there. Because what we want to do in that baseline culture audit is as Teresa, you said already, measure the patterns and then take all of these proof points and validate. These are the patterns that we're experiencing, the pluses and minuses of each. So
Right.
we're starting by understanding this is where we are today, that baseline, so that we can then begin to talk about where do we need to go? How do we need to shift?
Right. And one thing that I'd really like to bring to light is this is not a side road. So while you're doing this culture audit, you're literally bringing to light the specific issues that are driving the change and the specific elements that might be holding you back. So it's not just an assessment that is taking you off on a side road and you might feel like we're losing time in this initiative. As you're doing this, you are wrapping right in the issues that need to be put on the table, that need to be identified and shifted. So it's something that is literally is literally just beginning to make very quick forward momentum. And the reason I say it's quick is because the assessment and the language and the framework of the patterns allows you to do a deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of waiting months to identify like, well, oh, we're doing that thing again, we're literally opening the door and saying, here it is. This is the deep dive into what we're seeing at play in the culture.
So then what? Let's say now we know what our baseline audit is. And now we are also trying to, and we've identified maybe things that need to shift. How do we get into, and we're talking still really at the organizational level. We're talking about the experience of who are we when we all get together. How do you start to create an action plan around what needs to shift?
Right. So there's two components to that. So there's the organizational changes that can be identified and some planning around these shifts. But let's face it, change doesn't happen in organizations. Change happens in people. Mm-hmm. And then people drive through the shifts in the organization. So another component of this is to understand, how am I showing up? What role do I play, which you talked about with the wave, so when's it my turn to act? Are the ways in which I tend to feel comfortable and safe and, the patterns that I'm personally displaying on repeat, are they adding to the success? And or sometimes am I contributing to the things that are challenging? Or am I so set in the ways of the organization, so I'm the one that's echoing the statement, but we have to do it this way. Am I stuck? And so
sort of thought here in case somebody missed it. So when we talk about patterns in individuals, we're talking about the same archetype story patterns that we measured in the organization, because those patterns, we can understand how they show up in an individual experience, the storyline, my own storylines. Like you can see in my title here, I have creator, lover, caregiver. Those are my archetypes that are part of my profile. Those same patterns exist as well in organizations. So it's one framework that we're talking about, and looking at how do the patterns show up in the who are we aspect of the whole organizational system. And now Teresa shifted into understanding what are my own patterns.
Right. Which is part of that action planning phase, if you will. Okay. So how do we get change to happen? Well, at a baseline, we need to understand who are the individuals that we're asking to change, and how do they show up?
Right.
Other elements of the process can look at, okay, once we've identified our, point A, where we are today, we might point to, well, we'd like to go over there, right? So how are we going to draft
close the gap.
Close the gap between where we are and what might that look like? Let's go back to Eli Lilly for a moment. That might look like we've got really promising new drugs. The outcome we're seeing today is we're getting beat. We're getting beat to market by our competitors. We are not having the successes that we used to have in today's environment. So we want to shift that. We want to accelerate our progress, and we want to get our drugs safely vetted to market faster. It means we have to change something that we're doing internally. What do those changes look like? What do we need to stop doing? What do we need to do differently?
Right.
And we have to recognize, some of those shifts, and we can name those as well. So we can name that if we start this way, that looks like a new pattern.
I love that you're saying, what are we doing and what do we need to stop doing? Because you're referencing actual behavior. So when we're talking about culture shift, it's really like behavior change at scale, right? So in these patterns that we're referencing in archetypes, we can actually align different archetype patterns with specific motivations, specific ways that that pattern behaves. So when you get into that culture shift action plan, whether you're talking about how do I need to change as an individual or leader, how do we need to change as maybe a subculture team, or how does the whole organization need to shift? We can actually create kind of, a set of leadership behaviors, if you will. Like, this is what you started saying that we're going to stop doing, and this is what we're going to do instead.
Exactly.
Yeah, towards that new destination B.
Right. Well, and measurable as well. So if we're saying that these behaviors that we're going to start doing and that we're going to reward and we're going to recognize and we're going to track and measure, these behaviors are designed to get us to that new place. Well, we can quickly understand, are they beginning to make that shift? Are we, in a big ship like drug development that takes, as we know, years and enormous amounts of money and people involved. We know that ship is going to start to turn, and it's going to turn slow, but we can measure it, right? We can start to see the shift happening. And in other organizations, I think, that the ability to see that impact much faster is true as well. So we can start to see, are we having different outcomes? Are we beginning, are we making progress along that journey to the new place? And it won't happen overnight, but it doesn't have to take years. You can, I think, in the course of months, begin to witness those changes.
I would like to also comment that, when people are part of an organization where change is happening, and it is a little bit like, we'll go back to the audience wave, like, oh, it's my turn. Like, you got that little buzz and excitement of how do I need to shift and change? It becomes kind of organic. People literally, through the use of story and being able to see themselves in storylines and see their organization in storylines, suddenly it's less confusing, it's less nebulous, there's a lot of clarity that's gained in terms of what specifically could we do differently. And then they start to get engaged. And we're seeing that happen in some of the large culture shift initiatives that are underway in the partner community, where people are like, oh, it's my turn. I want to be part of this conversation. Here's what I'm noticing. And when do I get to do my thing?
Right. And I think another key ingredient is when people are engaged in that way and when the process is moving forward in a healthy way, the finger pointing goes down, right? So instead of it being, oh my God, your team failed, you didn't do what we're not succeeding because of your practices or your decisions. It's really like, wow, what went wrong here? Let's take a look at it and identify so that we don't repeat it. And so the group finger pointing goes down, the us versus them, and the individuals feel safe and vulnerable to step up and say, wow, I recognize I've been maybe holding us back a little bit here. I've been a little bit stuck in this regard, and I need some support. I need some help. I maybe need some training or a new way of working. I need support from my colleagues. I need to, get some help in a certain area, or I'd love to take on that challenge. I'm up for it. I'm engaged by it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love that you say that they step in. We've seen time and time again when archetypes, these storylines really become the language of teamwork, we see people call themselves out when they're stuck, right? And they go, oh, there I go into that pattern again. That's hard for me, the one that I get stuck in. And I love that, developing, because all change starts with self-awareness. We have to become aware of the way we're showing up, where it's getting in our way, and what we could do instead. So maybe let's just summarize what is, in designing the kind of culture shift, culture change intervention that you can do with Culture Talk. We're looking at measuring archetype patterns in individuals, on teams, and in organizations, some of that baseline work. We're talking about identifying which behaviors are serving us that we want to do more, which behaviors are getting in the way. We're also creating kind of like the archetypes give us a framework for looking at where do we want to go and what's the delta between where we are today and where we want to go. And the storytelling is just this very organic, sticky, human, right, way of having that change really take root and take hold and have some staying power as well.
Yeah. Yep. And we didn't even talk today about how fun it can be. It does not need to be
fun,
and difficult, although we know it can be. So acknowledgement that, embarking on a change or a transformation journey can be challenging, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be fun. It can also be exciting and engaging. And that's the promise that the Culture Talk tool set allows you to bring, whether you are someone who is leading that kind of change or you've been called upon internally in your organization, whether you're in a role that has the culture, moniker hung on it, or whether you're someone who's just been, a leader in an organization who sees the need to shift what's going on in some capacity. Or whether you're a consultant or a coach who's helping your clients with those same types of projects, we'd invite you to take a look at what's going on here at Culture Talk. We have a set of tools and a number of facilitation materials, workshops, pre-designed programs to get you. So instead of scratching your head and saying, like, I don't know where to start, we have a number of entry points that will support you getting started and beginning this transformation journey. And the beginning of our journey, if you join us here at Culture Talk, is our certification program. So we have one coming up in May. Cynthia, maybe you have the details.
We have 2 cohorts that'll kick off on May 2nd. We'll do the first 4 Tuesdays in May and the first 4 Tuesdays in June. We will not meet on the Memorial Day week holiday here in the US. But each of those, we do it via Zoom. Cohorts tend to be 5 to 10 people. Teresa or I teach each one of those cohorts. They're 2-hour Zoom classes with kind of a deep immersion type of experience where you get to try on what are my own archetype patterns, and we go through archetypes, we go through all kinds of experiences that you could turn around and deliver as part of, one-off engagements, or in the case of this culture shift, we're really talking about a full-scale, across-the-board cultural experience that you can do with the tool set we built at Culture Talk. So we'll talk that.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, we'll drop the information on certification into the comments as well.
And if you're imminently involved and you're about to start this process, don't let that stop you. Some of the most successful partners join us because they're, head deep into a transformation that they're responsible for. And the learning happens so it's learn and apply, which is really a fantastic way to bring the learning to life and get the most value from it.
And you get a lot of support here at Culture Talk with lots of people that are doing this kind of work. I'll give just a quick shout out to Ronaldo Naves from Olivia Global, who's going to be joining us here on LinkedIn Live on April 27th, sharing his experience, the team he's running in a culture, like a really big culture shift program at a very large organization across Latin America. And he's going to share kind of what they're learning along the way as they have applied the archetype framework and the Culture Talk tool set. So that'll be April 27th. So that's also on the event page here at Culture Talk. So if you think you'd like to hear more about it, sign up for that as well. Any closing thoughts, Teresa? We're headed into a
great conversation. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon and hearing from you as well. Thanks for being here today.